there's one intelligent thought in this book. Only one. And you can only find it in the German translation. I'm being a bit mean to the author, but he sold millions of copies of his incoherent ramblings. So what is this one intelligent thought, you ask, that you can only find in the German translation? Well, Huntington divides humanity into distinct civilizations. He says there are, 7 or 8 civilizations. And that's not the intelligent thought. But yeah, he divides humanity into civilizations, and there's a Western civilization, and a Muslim civilization, and a Chinese civilization, and a Japanese civilization, and a Latin American civilization. And he provides a shaky conceptual idea of what civilization means to him. He says there's a core and a periphery, and there's a core language, and he gives different properties of what makes a civilization. And in a sober moment he realizes, well, actually my conceptual considerations don't really work for the examples I'm giving, right? For example, what is the core of the Muslim civilization? But it doesn't stop him from writing another couple of 100 pages. So the one intelligent thought in this book comes from the translator, Holger Fliesbach. He translated this book into German, and before the German version gets going, the translator is allowed to make a few remarks. And he basically says, well, the author insisted that I would translate civilization with Zivilisation, which seems like an obvious choice. But he says, well, not so fast. Zivilisation is totally different, has totally different connotations from civilization. And I think that Kultur would be a much better translation. And kind of triumphantly, he explains why Kultur is a better translation, and obviously he prevailed. The book was called Kampf der Kulturen and not Kampf der Zivilisationen. Interesting. So why is there such a linguistic divide, right? He mentions the sociologist Norbert Elias, who wrote extensively on that matter, right? And according to Norbert Elias, there is a linguistic divide. Kultur, the German word, has different connotations from the English and French equivalent. Same for Zivilisation. As Elias would point out, Kultur is not an objective reality, but a word that changes its meaning over time. Currently, he would say it is used as something that divides us. Germans would say, well, this person comes from a different Kulturkreis. Germans would typically think of their own culture as being represented by the arts, the opera, maybe Goethe, Enlightenment, basically lots of things that they consider to be a very positive representation of what is German, something they are proud of. Or maybe they would go beyond German Kultur and speak of a abendländische Kultur. But it seems to have something to do with the past, or a continuation of the past, or a reinterpretation of the past. If they are very progressive and artsy and tolerant, they might include modern art. Okay, but the main point here is that this notion of what culture means is a process. It has changed over time. 200 years ago, Germans, or the educated middle class, did not so much think of great minds of the past. They thought about the future. human progress of humanity as the whole, or maybe they would have thought about the world spirit, depending on who their favorite philosopher was at the time. So Kultur was something that you can achieve if you sit down and you write or you compose, right? You can bring Kultur forward. It's a progressive thought. We know the names of the great German poets and composers, and Austrian, so the German-speaking poets and composers. Most of them lived before Germany existed as a state, when Germany was divided into many dukedoms and kingdoms. Kultur became political in the German national movements of the 19th century. Kultur was something that went beyond the confines of the small dukedoms and kingdoms, a unifying force that could bring Germans together. They picked up on the more abstract notion of Kultur from the 18th century as a force of progress that would bring forward humanity as a whole, and turned it into a force of progress that could unify Germany as a whole, the German-speaking world. Traditionally, Kultur was the passion of liberal romantics. In the 19th century, those liberal romantics increasingly saw Kultur as an antidote to the aristocracy, or aristocracies, plural. The various court societies around the many German kings and dukes all had their own unique sets of rules and etiquette, loosely emulating French court society. The German court society spoke French, and they behaved in a pseudo-French way, right? So all these different court societies, the Bavarian court society and the Hanoverian court society and the Prussian court society, they would emulate or reinvent French court society etiquette and so on. Of course, they hated the French Revolution and the Napoleonic turn of the French Revolution, because Napoleon was beginning to control much of Germany, and they celebrated when Napoleon vanished. If you disliked the aristocracy from a liberal middle-class perspective, then this dislike could easily turn on an anti-French connotation. This anti-French connotation does not necessarily have to be directed against France. Maybe it was just directed against the German aristocracies who would speak French. Right? So that was a bit of a blurry line, who was the target of anti-French sentiment in the German middle class. Kultur was increasingly imbued with a nationalist connotation. It was less associated with a humanist progress of the world spirit. The increasingly nationalist connotation was embodied by people like the brothers Grimm, who collected fairy tales, and they had a political agenda in mind. They wanted to demonstrate the unifying power of Kultur across the German-speaking world, and they wanted to amplify this unifying power. And it was one of the two brothers Grimm, Jakob, I think, who inspired Hoffmann von Fallersleben, the guy who wrote the German national anthem that we still sing today, despite his extreme anti-Semitic views. The unification of Germany, which came about in 1871, was paradoxically a triumph for the nobility. So the aristocracy was the Prussian hyper-militaristic nobility that brought about the unification of Germany, the German-speaking world, most of it. And it was not the liberal middle class. It was not a revolution of the middle class. And this must have been a very confusing time for the nationalist middle class. How can we deal with it? How did that happen that it was the Prussian nobility that brought about the unification of Germany? Right? The nobility was always against the unification of Germany. They thought they would lose their privileges. From a Prussian perspective, when you think that you can defeat militarily any player on the Central European map because you have better weapons at your disposal, then the idea of unifying Germany under Prussian rules, and with the Prussian king becoming the Prussian emperor, that becomes quite attractive all of a sudden. And many in the middle class identified now with the success of this new Prussian way. And the old reservations about aristocracy vanished for many people in the middle class. But for some in the middle class, it was a deeply confusing, alienating time. Right? They didn't like militarism and diplomacy and politics. Historians of the 19th century were often people who said we should just ignore politics. History was to be understood as the history of Kultur, not the history of nasty things like states and diplomacy and intrigues and politics. These things were disgusting and barely noteworthy. Important was the Kultur itself as the primary focus of history. So we have the old idea of humanist progress. For the aristocracy, it was the other way around. Kultur was the playground for the educated but irrelevant middle class. Questions of diplomacy, politics, war, peace were the realm for the really important people, the upper class, the aristocratic upper class. Now, the idea that the upper class was aristocratic changed with a slow but steady increase in upward social mobility for anyone in the middle class happy to play by the rulebook of the aristocracy. If you did, then in the Kaiserreich, you might have a stellar career in front of you. And your son might be admitted into a Schlagende Verbindung, a student fraternity that engaged in ritual fencing. Traditionally, ritual fencing was to teach noblemen to defend their honor in a duel. Duels were quite common in the German-speaking world for much longer than in other countries of Europe. In France and England, duels were already frowned upon in the late 1700s. In the German-speaking world, duels were common far into the 19th century. The nobility was questioning the supremacy of the rule of law for themselves in the German-speaking world. They were the rule of law when it comes to questions of honor. And this was a perfect reflection, of course, of the strange social fabric of the divided German-speaking world. The ritual fencing that still exists today was conducted between student fraternities. It was not about honor. It wasn't about defending your honor when you were insulted. It was a formality. And it was not so much about winning, but about standing your man. So you would not flinch, right? And the way it was handled, it would typically result in you having your face slashed open by your opponent, and you would secretly hope for that to happen, because then you would leave the duel with a scar in your face, and this scar would be a mark of honor. So you would hope that you would be able to conduct yourself in a ritual duel in a manner where you would not flinch, and you would not even flinch when your face is slashed open and you're bleeding and you keep standing your man. And this would be your ticket into the satisfaktionsfähige Gesellschaft. When you want to have a big career in the civil service, politics, the military, then you have to be a member of the satisfaktionsfähige Gesellschaft. And also in other professions, it would be a massive asset to be part of the most powerful network in the German-speaking world. Typically, one had to be from a noble background to join such a fraternity that allows you to enter the satisfaktionsfähige Gesellschaft. But towards the end of the 19th century, some fraternities opened up to selected members of the educated middle class. And for a brief period, it also opened up to Jewish members. Often the Jewish members would find themselves in a very toxic, highly anti-Semitic environment. And they would have to tolerate their own fraternity singing anti-Semitic songs. The main point here is that the fraternities opened up to the middle classes, or selected members of the middle class.
Meine Partei zweite Mal getroffen.
Hause ist links. Mein Bund erklärt die Abfuhr. Silenzium. Eine Verehrung führt ab nach dem 7. Gang. Partie ex Silenzium ex.
All they had to do was to embrace the worldview of the aristocracy, maybe join in with them when they would make fun of useless romantics in the humanist middle class and their impractical infatuation of Kultur. In Britain, the upper class was much more skilled in taking the educated middle class seriously and embracing Kultur.
Our cultural heritage has to be preserved.
For whom? For people like you mean? For the educated middle classes. Why should the rest of the country subsidize the pleasures of the middle class few? Theatre, opera, ballet. Subsidizing art in this country is nothing more than a middle class rip-off.
Oh, Minister, how can you say such a thing? Subsidy is about education, preserving the pinnacles of our civilization. Or haven't you noticed?
Don't patronize me, Humphrey. I believe in education too. I'm a graduate of the London School of Economics, may I remind you.
In the German-speaking world, around the Kaiserreich, Kultur was not taken seriously. Yes, the Kaiser would like his favorite composers and go to the opera, but he would have very strong opinions about it. In Germany, culture became associated with a pretentious section within the educated middle class that cannot accept its place below the upper class. But this opening up represented a power shift away from the nobility towards the middle class. And this seems paradoxical. How can the middle class be in power? Right? The upper class is in power. Right? Yes, so members of the old middle class became the new upper class. At first, middle class careerists are merely tolerated by their noble peers. But the ones who are only tolerated are increasingly the ones who see themselves as the only deserving members of the German upper class, whereas the members of the nobility, they are the ones that are who are tolerated by them, right? So they would say, this guy, he has a title in his name, a von or a prince. So maybe that's the reason why he ended up in this powerful position, whereas I ended up here because of my merit. Conservative right-wing ideology becomes the common ground that binds together the new career-oriented middle class and the aristocracy, and it glosses over the contradiction between the new elitist ideal of meritocracy and the old elitist ideal of nobility. So let's focus on what unites us. Patriotism, a disdain for outsider groups, typically socialists, maybe Jews at certain points in history. Under Bismarck, even Catholics were becoming an outsider group that cannot be trusted, which seems crazy because Catholics make roughly one half of the German population. So what is the difference whether we see Kultur as something that is deeply rooted in the past or a force of progress as the guiding light of Kultur, right? Depending on who their favorite philosopher was.